He served as the highest-ranking military official ever to hold a House of Representatives, and recently made national news when he conducted a rather insurgent campaign inside the Democratic primary in the Pennsylvania U.S. Senate race. He's a politician, but he's a rare combination of incredibly qualified and uniquely independent. Ladies and gentlemen, former 3-star Admiral and U.S. House of Representatives member, please help me welcome Mr. Joe Sestak.
Thank you very much, Greg, Hale. Thank you all for having me here this evening. Everybody brought this together. I'm very appreciative of this opportunity to talk to the students that have assembled here this evening. Because what I want to talk about are the two reasons why I think, or I hope, that you're here. When I speak, I want to speak to these two issues from 31 years in the United States Navy, from having served as a public official in the House of Representatives. And that is the importance of the United States engagement throughout this world, particularly through multilateral organizations. And second, to what one of the men who was showing up on that screen, President John F. Kennedy, once said, "One man can make a difference, and every man should try." When I speak about the first issue this evening, the importance of multilateral organizations to the United States of America and to this world, I'd like to talk about it in 3 parts. The first is about our interests, our self-interest. The second has to do with our values. And the third about our approaches to these multilateral organizations. As I begin with the very first, our interest, I think it's important for us always to remember that even with that Revolutionary War that gave us our freedoms, that battle, Yorktown, that gave us the final victory, never would have come about if it hadn't been for a foreign nation, a foreign officer. For those that remember our history, George Washington was losing the Battle of Yorktown when he decided to hand operational control of the American forces to a foreign general, a Frenchman, who under the combined effort of the two armies and under his direction snatched victory from the jaws of defeat against the British that day. And in honor of that we had secured our freedom because of an ally, the sculpture that sits closest to the seat of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, the President of the United States. The sculpture that is closest to the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. is not of an American. It's not of an American military man or woman. It's of a Frenchman, that French general, General Rochambeau, that won us our freedom that night. 225 years later, I commanded an aircraft carrier battery in the war in Afghanistan. And in those 30 ships I commanded, as we launched strike in that conflict, was a French ship. Among those 30 ships, only 10 of them were United States ships. Were others, a Japanese admiral with 4 vessels, a nation that not had come out with its military in the Sea of Japan since World War II, but joined us in the Indian Ocean as we were there to begin this global war of terror. We had the Greeks with us, the Portuguese, the Spanish. We had the world. Having worked through the United Nations and NATO and other defense arrangements and multilateral organizations throughout the world, the nations had come together with us for theirs and our security. And then one night, I was told take your aircraft carrier battle through the Straits of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf for what we thought at that moment would begin a jumpstart to the war in Iraq. As I went through the Straits of Hormuz, only the British and the Australians came with me. Right then, I knew that this was going to be a tragic misadventure. We had not been able to work through the multilateral organizations to ensure that our collective response of the world was one that was united and in everyone's self-interest. We were different in that war. Different than the first Iraq. Different than Bosnia, where in those conflicts, over 50% of those forces were non-US, while less than 10% were so in this war in Iraq. We owned it, both the cost and any potential benefits, but all the costs are ours. And so my lesson from those 31 years in the United States military, having worked out there at the point of the sphere with the youth of America, and also back at the White House as Director of Defense Policy during the Clinton administration, is that America's security is so much advanced if we can work through multilateral organizations to bring about our interests. The history for me, parts of it were on that film, was of the 20th century, to where, after World War I, we squandered the peace we had secured. The League of Nations failed. We didn't bring about any arms controls agreement except for one, a battleship arms control agreement. We never created those economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And what ensued was a global depression we could not manage that gave rise to fascism, that we did not have the bulwark of defense arrangements to confront before they launched their strikes, and World War II occurred. But after World War II, we had learned our lesson. We created the United Nations here in the United States of America. And then we went about with 67 defense arrangements from NATO to CETO throughout this world of ours. And then we created the IMF and the World Bank and so many other multilateral institutions. And we won that Cold War without a conflict. And after the Cold War, we enhanced what we had learned. We adapted those Cold War institutions to the New World. We expanded NATO. Europe created their Eurozone, and even a bank that I would argue today, as bad as that crisis they have, at least they're able to try to manage it without going into a recession, pulling us into it again. My lesson was that we are best when we are engaged in multilateral institutions because it represents our character. That it isn't just our individual achievements that we can measure. We always have to measure our individual desires, our self-interest, as part of the greater global effort. If there is greater peace and prosperity throughout this world, it bodes better for our prosperity, our peace, our security. And so that's why I believe, having been to over 80 countries in those 31 years, having watched the decision to go to war from the White House, that we are served best when we are engaged in this world of ours. But second is our interest. We tend to forget at times that we were the very first nation that was ever founded on principle, not power. When Tiananmen Square happened in China years ago, they held up quotes and portraits of Thomas Jefferson. They held up a man that represented those principles. As I went throughout those 80-some countries, I learned how much we are respected for the power of our military and the power of our economy. But I came to understand how we're admired for the power of our ideals. I can remember going into Egypt one time in the early 90s, a young officer in charge of his first ship. And a number of Egyptian officers got underway with me. And as we pulled back into port, one of them, as he left the ship, said, "Captain, can I ask you a question? Or at least make a statement." He said, "I gotta tell you something. You treat your enlisted men as though they're equal to you." I said, "Oh, they respect rank. They say yes sir, no sir." He said, "No, that's not what I mean. You treat them as though they're equal to you as a human being. We don't." And so I told him the story of George Washington. And when he gave the very first medal in the new American Army at Valley Forge, he directed that this piece of purple ribbon that centuries later became our Purple Heart could only be given to an enlisted man, not an officer, to demonstrate that the way to the top in this new American Army was like the society we were creating, open to everyone. You weren't to be an officer merely because you could purchase that office or because you inherited it. And so, when a country was needed to bring together the first Muslim nation ever to do a military exercise with Israel, it was the United States that brought it together. As I oversaw that exercise between Turkey and Israel back in 1998, of what it might bode for the future, I'll never forget looking at the Turk uniform. And every button, every emblem, every insignia on it was identical to United States military uniform, with the exception of the beautiful crescent that was on their uniform. It's something we have to keep in mind about our ideals, so that when we say waterboarding isn't torture, we chip away at the strength of what we bring to our leadership out there. Third, our approach to these multilateral institutions. It really is about self-interest. I get that. For us, it's undergirded by our values. It's why we're admired, not just respected. It's a way to try to bring all these different nations together in their self-interest, as hard as it is, for one common effort together. 100 years ago, exactly 100 years ago, we signed a treaty called the North Pacific Fur Seal Treaty. You've all studied it, I'm sure. The fur seal was being decimated by 4 nations: Great Britain, America, Japan, and Russia. From 5 million by 1911, it was down to only 150,000 seals left. Until they came together and decided that only the United States would hunt these seals. The United States would give each of the other countries its fair share. Manages it so that within 4 to 5 years, the growth had gone back to 2 million and gotten back to 5 million in the years to come. And so what we did in this is what I think people have to try to come to grips with, whether it's Turkey operating with Israel or whatever it is. And that is aggrandize those interests, those gains that are out there, and then distribute those gains to each individual nation. And then deter those who are not part of the agreement from violating it. In this case, since these were the 4 nations, that hunted them for their civilian populace. Anyone else who tried to sell them, no nation of those four would purchase it from them. I bring that up because I would argue today, trying to do that has changed for two significant reasons. It's still the game plan by which you have to approach multilateral efforts. But something new is here today. The first are different nations, in particular China. I can remember backpacking through China the first year they permitted individual travel by Americans. I got on a sheep vessel to go from Chongqing to Wuhan. For $1 a day, you could live in a room on a floor with 20 peasants with the sheep outside. If you only could afford $1 for the 3 days down the Yangtze River, you could sleep with the sheep. So I splurged and slept on the floor. As we went down the Yangtze River through the three gorges, because I knew eventually they were going to be dammed, and I wanted to see them this first year that the Americans were allowed to travel by themselves. And they had just opened up these cities. As we went down through there, I wanted to see, being a mariner, how they drove this ship through these gorges, and asked if I could go up there. I was the only Westerner around. Everyone else was a peasant, but there was someone who always happened to be around who could speak a bit of English. And so when I asked if I could go up to the bridge, which was locked, the gentleman who had befriended me with a bit of English basically was following me. Demurred. I asked a few hours later when I saw him again, because I thought he had said I'd find out. When he came back, and when I asked him, he again, in a different way, demurred. But I was a Westerner. I just wanted yes or no. And so I asked a third time when I saw him later the next day. And in an embarrassed way, he said no. I didn't get it. He had already told me no twice. And it dawned on me that this was a culture, the hermit kingdom, that we better understand. And so when the U.S. State Department has its new 100,000 person initiative to send 100,000 United States citizen students over to China, it's with a purpose to try to understand this new nation that's become a superpower and is coming out on an international stage and had no role this past century in setting up the rules of those international multilateral organizations. And it is bent upon making sure it helps reshape those rules in its self-interest and interprets them on its own. And one can understand that. One better understand who you're dealing with. And so I bring that up because it's a changed environment for this nation of ours. Also for another reason. I saw it during the landmine treaty, where something called an NGO suddenly appeared. Non-governmental organizations that are proliferating all throughout the world today. It was almost a fourth branch of government. I was in the Clinton administration at the National Security Council, and initially we wanted nothing to do with the landmine treaty until individuals, citizens got involved in the NGO, so much so that the United States Army set up an office to do nothing but deal with NGOs. It had become a fourth branch of a nation. And finally, to the second point I really wanted to speak about tonight, that maxim from John F. Kennedy, that one man, today obviously, he would have said one person can make a difference, and everyone should try. I'll never forget going through Eastern Europe, again, taking 60 days leave from the military to go to my father's hometown in communist Czechoslovakia, and going to Bratislava, from where you can see Austria. And having found somebody who I still think was my relative, but I'm not sure, and walking to the border, and he pointed at it and said, "Someday, freedom." I think about that when I watch what's happening in this nation of ours today, from Wall Street occupiers to Tea Partiers. They merely are replicating what Mohammed Bouazizi did in Tunisia, that street peddler, that felt the fruits of his labor should no longer be taken by the powerful and the connected, those that ruled, and no longer respected what was his. As their middle class dwindled, as the income disparity grew and grew, and when he set himself as an individual on fire, he set the Middle East ablaze, not dissimilar than the individuals who tore down that wall. I strongly believe, after living my entire life, and the reason when I was asked to come here this evening, I jumped at it in a heartbeat. I lived my life with the youth of America. On a United States aircraft carrier, there's 5,000 sailors, 5 times the number of students in this room. Their average age is 19 and a half. They run a nuclear reactor. They fix your plane before you get in it. You never ask a question. You just go off to combat, knowing that a 19-year-old has been good enough as an individual to do what needs to be done. This nation needs you. I spoke at Lycoming College yesterday. Before that, 60 students at Stanford. I'll go anywhere to speak with the youth of America. You're different. You elected to come here. You have some interest. I hope it isn't just in multilateral institutions. I hope it's in some sort of service, because this nation needs you more than ever. I'll finish with a story about how highly I think of you and what you can do. Off Afghanistan, one of those nights, I launched 8 pilots. 7 of them were veterans of the first Iraqi war, all males. I launched a very young, brand new pilot that evening with them, a young woman just out of flight school. And she went off with them in her F-18. When I joined the military during the Vietnam era, we didn't have one ships. Never mind flying an F-18. That night, she proved to be the one that disobeyed the orders, not to dive below 20,000 feet, until we had ensured that we could do a quick scan with other instruments of war to ensure that the Taliban didn't have any shoulder-fired missiles to endanger the aircraft as it dove low. But 8 special forces had been ambushed. 4 were dead, and the other 4 frantically called for help immediately. Of those 8, she was the one that decided on her own she couldn't wait to ask permission, and dove 3 times and strafed. And those 4 men picked up their dead and came home that night. That was a person. Because she was given a fair individual opportunity, but alive with a greater effort, which represents the best of America's character. Rugged individualism, aligned with a common enterprise. Everyone striving for their individual achievement, not measured apart from that greater good, the common mission, the greater effort. She was the one that evening, the youngest of them all, that ensured that mission succeeded. I would argue, for those 4 families and that night, she did what John F. Kennedy spoke about. Our institutions, in my mind, have failed us. Both parties, I don't care if you're Wall Street, I don't care if you're international union leaders. Right now, Pete, this future is for those that are willing to take on the establishment and question, is there a way it cannot not be done better? Willing to sacrifice something of themselves to make sure this nation does it right. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think you youth are tremendous. And if anyone doesn't think so, just operate with under a template of responsibility and